I'm Albert Lipscomb, the seventh son of Ira and Grace Lawrence Lipscomb. We have an older brother, passed away before we were born, but his name was Robert Eugene. Name in the family, we've known him and knew as we referred to him as Bobby Jean. And our oldest brother was Lawrence. He passed away several years ago in 2016. And then our brother Edward. And so we are here today to talk about the Lipscomb family. It goes back over 350 years approximately. But we'll introduce ourselves and be able to tell part of the story of the Lipscomb family.
I'm Claude Byron Lipscomb. I was born December 3rd, 1942. My first name was the name of one of my mother's brothers, her oldest brother. My middle name came from a retired farmer, moved down to Baldwin County from Michigan. I'm the fourth of 7 sons, and therefore that makes me exactly in the middle. But I am the oldest of the 4 that are surviving, that are here today. I finished Foley High School in 1961, and in '62 I married Carol Dubose from Bon Secure. And after 2 years of farming, I went to Auburn University and graduated in 4 years with an agricultural engineering degree. Carol and I had 5 children. Our surviving daughter is Shannon Lipscomb Spivey, and she works for Baldwin County. I worked 41 years for Alabama Power Company, and I've been retired since '08, and I raised ranch bred American quarter horses and a registered herd of Texas Longhorn cattle, and I have a beef herd, which for the last 24 years, that's occupied all of my time.
I'm Sheldon Lipscomb. I graduated from school in 1963, and I married Betsy Carver, and farmed. I didn't go to college. I went straight, come back to the farm. And I farmed till I was 43 years old, and then I had to go find me some other income during the 80s that things got bad. So I went and got a job at, back then it was Rower, and then it was Goodrich, and now Collins Aerospace. Worked on airplanes for 26 years.
I'm Oswald Henry Lipscomb, and I was born in 1947, August the 18th, and married Patricia Oral from Foley, and we as well grew up and graduated from Foley High School and came back and farmed, and same as Sheldon, I took a job at Rower Industries, but then later worked with Winter Turf Sod Company and their sod operation. They were our cousins, and I ran their computer department for 15 years.
And again, I'm Albert Lipscomb, the youngest of our family. We grew up here in this house. The house was built about 1913, Michael Weeks' home. So it's kind of like a lot of memories flooding through our minds when we come back today. There were 6 of us, as we talked about, grew up together, not this table, but a table similar around the table. We all went to Magnolia Springs School in the community a few years, through the years, 6th grade, and then on to Foley High School. And I finished at Foley also in 1969. Went to college 2 years in Oklahoma, and then finished at Mobile College, now the University of Mobile, and met my wife, Rhonda Dudley, and we were married in 1977. And then in 1980, thereabout, we remodeled this home and have lived here along the way. We have 2 children. One lives in Texas and one lives in England, and it's interesting there because Lipscombs about 12 generations back moved here from England, Silverton, England, to Virginia, and then Virginia on South Carolina to Alabama, and then down to Baldwin County.
He didn't mention it, but he served as county commissioner in Baldwin County and also as a state senator, and now serves as on the board of registrars. But so he has connection with the county as well.
Served in the state senate from 1989 to 2002, 2 Democratic governors, 2 Republican governors. But through the years, and that takes us all the way back, if I may say, we're kind of putting the story together, but there's an Abner Lipscomb that actually was in the territorial legislature, as we understand, in 1817 and on the Supreme Court of Alabama, and later moved to Texas. That's a story in itself. We can't get into all the details, but we may be able to share a little more along the way. But that was way back when, and he served the free state of Texas for a time. It was actually a nation, and then as they become a state of the United States.
The question of when our family moved to Baldwin County, of course, Albert has mentioned that we originated in England and came over, and we knew our family history from locally, but we came across a book in 1979 that gave us historical records all the way back to England and our Lipscomb families and descendants and cousins. But James Philip Lipscomb came to Baldwin County in about 1877 and bought property in 1882 and lived there on that property until he passed away in 1933. But he had 6 children and 2 boys and 4 girls, and most of the Lipscombs in Baldwin County have descended from him. I think there's some that's moved in from other areas in more recent years, but we go back to about 150 years ago. And his son, Edward Preston, was our grandfather. He and his brother Albert Lipscomb raised families here, and then the 4 girls raised families. One of them married a Carver, and one married a Williams, and they are relatives as well in the area. So James Philip has a lot of descendants in the area. Some of them are continuing to farm even today. We've all retired and are out of the actual active farming, but they're still farming. Doug Lipscomb is one in particular that has a sod farm and a row crop farm here in the community, and he's our cousin's son, a relative. But we've been here for a good while, and James Phillip lived on the property he bought, and then his son Edward Preston lived on property next to him, and then our dad bought property next to him, and I still live on that property today. So the land, there's 3 generations, and then my son was in the Air Force, but he was, and my daughters live on the place as well. They were the 4th generation, but we've been in Baldwin County a long time.
I have that a black box that James Phillip had most of his life, I guess, kept his official papers and deeds and receipts for where he paid taxes, and I have one dating back to 1882, a receipt where he had paid taxes, and there are a lot of other items in that box that sat dormant for about 80 years in his attic. He died in 1933, and his wife Joanna died in 38. And as far as I can tell, the box was put up in the attic of the house, and that no one opened it for 80 years until it was given to me, and I opened it and went through it. And there's a lot of documents in there that are very interesting. There's an old 1902 map of Baldwin County that I find really interesting, and it just makes you feel good to have a little tie to those ancestors that you didn't actually know, you just heard about them all your life.
James Phillip's property is still in cousin's possession. Dolores Russell and her son Darrell live on the old home place. This was her great-grandfather, and she and her son reside on that property, so it's still in the family even today.
Also mentioned the book in 300 years. It was written about 40 years ago, so the times past, but from a little town, Silverton, England. Our daughter I mentioned lives there, and I've actually visited that church and the baptismal records there, and the birth certificate, some of those official papers going back again around 1680, as we recall. They're about coming to Virginia, and without camping out on the story and giving all of the generations there, was in Virginia a good many years, over 100 years approximately, and then on to South Carolina, but moved to Marengo County and several areas. Marengo County, I believe Greene County was one of the ones that our great-great-grandfather came to. So we're there, maybe it's Hale County. The counties have kind of been divided up through the years. But with that was important. Marengo County, there were a number of people came there. Alabama, of course, was not one of the original 13 colonies, but they came and they were there and farmed for many years. And then from there, James Phillip, as a younger man, came here to Baldwin County, as Oswald said, and a lot of history. Part of it's just kind of refined to bring it down. But his home, it was built around 1885, stood until just recently. We do have pictures of that home and in our memory, in our mind, of course, going back. And then our grandfather, as I mentioned, Edward Preston Lipscomb's home is still standing today. And then on Oswald's front porch, if I may say, he can actually look out and see, as he mentioned, great-grandfather's home place, grandfather's home place, where we lived, and then his family and the generations. So a lot of history, pretty deep roots here in Baldwin County.
Grandpa Jimmy came down, they've already said that, but he came down here right after the Civil War, and when he came, he brought some Indian corn with him. I have some of it here. This is 1 ear and some shell corn. It's all different colors. And he planted it until we died, and actually when he died, he was picking corn in a wagon that we got out front. You'll have a picture of it later. He didn't die in the field, but he had a heart attack and he went to the house, but that's what he was doing the day he passed away. And our daddy took the corn and planted it all his career. And when Daddy died, we were all farming, and we were trying to farm big and thought we didn't fool with this for a little while. And Daddy had left some of it in the crib on that last year that he planted it. And one day Claude was in Mobile County, and he came over and got some of this seed and took it back to his house and put it in a Ziploc bag back like that. And he kept it in his freezer for 33 years. And one day he called me and he said, "You think that corn's any good?" And I said, "Put some in the ground and see." So he did, and it all came up. And he reached in that bag and gave me a handful of corn, and I took it and planted it in my garden. I was working out there at Goodrich. And I planted it in my garden, and I took that corn and planted it again. And it took me 5 years to get enough corn to plant 5 acres. And after that, I got twin grandsons that are 34 years old. And they got interested in it, and they decided they wanted to try to make a business out of it. And they making cornmeal, grits, and corn flour and fish fry. They take the flour and mix up some fish fry. And they got a deal with Publix. They've been putting it in Publix grocery store. They just got that going last week, and somebody told me that they went in the Fairhope Publix store and they've already got it on the shelf.
Yeah, we've been farmers through the years. Grandpa Jimmy farmed, of course, and Papa farmed, and our dad farmed, and then we farmed as younger people. But corn and other crops, soybeans, were part of our farming, and but Dad's specialty was livestock, and Claude has followed suit with that. He's enjoyed raising cattle, and he was involved with the Robertsdale Livestock Auction. Claude may want to talk about that a little bit, but
yeah, I remember as a small child, my dad going in this community to every farmer, which almost everyone farmed. Either they farmed or they were on the shrimp boat and they went out in the Gulf shrimping. But most people farmed, and most of them had some livestock. Our dad loved all livestock, and he did row crop, but he loved the livestock more than the other part of farming. But he did what he had to make a living to support raise six sons. But in the 40s, there was not a good market where we could sell our beef cattle. So Daddy had a truck at the time, but it was not a new truck and it was not that good a shape, but he would load it up and go to Mobile to Hayes Davis to sell his cattle. And I remember over there around Daphne, some of those hills before the alternate 98 and all, I'd be scared to death going down one of those steep hills, and then that truck would barely he'd get to going so fast to hit that bottom, and then it just barely would make it up to the top of the next hill, and it had this little boy scared. But anyway, Daddy liked Hayes Davis, but it was just too big of a trip in those days and too many problems. So he and Mr. Horace Driver were friends. Mr. Driver would come down and buy cattle at times from Daddy, but they decided it'd be good to have a market for beef cattle here in the county. So Mr. Driver lived around Loxley, and they bought some land in Robertsdale, and my dad helped Mr. Driver sell stock in the auction to get it started. And once it got going in 49, I believe, February 49 was the first sale they had, and I remember attending that. And my dad had 10 white feeder pigs that were the first thing to ever sell in that sale, and I remember that like it was yesterday. But anyway, that business was a thriving business in Baldwin County, and it served Mobile County and several other counties in Florida. Brought cattle to Robertsdale, and it was an enormous thing. They had one sale a week on Mondays, and my dad was the weighmaster, but he also was on the board of directors for 29 years, and he served as a chairman of the board for 9 of those years. But it was very successful and meant a lot to the county, to the farmers of the county, to have that market so close by. But over time, the numbers of cattle dwindled and the sale became weak, and about 5 years ago it ceased to exist, and they've dissolved the corporation and all now. But it was a huge part of our dad's life. And like I say, he loved cattle from the earliest age, and he was never in the Cattlemen's Association, but he was a leader in the cattle business. And about 100 yards from this house, across the corner over there, intersection is a dipping vat where he would help bring everybody's cattle from the community in, and had a corral over there, and they would jump every cow in, force them to jump into the dipping vat to control Texas tick fever was a problem in about 1915, and then on up through probably the 30s. But anyway, Dad owned cattle and raised them. He knew cattle like nobody I've ever known.
He had cattle most of his life, but one summer, our grandparents, mother's parents, lived in California, and he spent his whole life here in Baldwin County. But one particular summer, he got a friend to farm his land and a brother to look after his cattle, and he loaded us all in a 1953 Ford station wagon. There was 6 children at that time, and he and mother. And we took the whole summer and went to California. And that was an interesting trip. We stopped at cousins' houses on the way, and but we eventually made it to California, Marysville, California, where our grandparents lived. And from there we visited the redwood forest and different things that were a trip. But when he came back that fall, before school started, he had sold his pigs because he couldn't get anybody to look after his pigs. He had somebody to look after his cows and his row crops. But the first Monday he was back, he was at stockyard again and bought some more pigs. So he had as many different kinds of animals as you could dream of. He had cattle and horses and hogs and sheep, and then he got into chickens and turkeys and guineas and pheasants and gooses, and he had, if it was an animal, he loved it. And,
I probably got more of that, his love for livestock in my DNA than maybe, although all of you
We all
liked it.
love
I
animals,
guess.
but you got more of that dose.
Yeah, and I mentioned earlier that I've got registered Texas Longhorns and beef cattle, but I've got my dad's branding iron that he used his whole life, and I couldn't even guess how many cattle have been branded by that iron. It's in the thousands, but anyway, it's been heated and cooled off so many times, it's razor thin, but it was IL bar, and I've got that branding iron. But even today, I still brand my cattle and my horses. I freeze brand my horses, but it's just been a huge part of our life.
Along the way, we did farm together as a partnership, and there were 6 of us. Claude was away, mentioned working with Alabama Power Company for many of those years, but we worked together, and at one time we had between 400 and 500 brood cows, if I remember correctly, and Dad knew most of them. He didn't maybe know every one, but if one went missing, and after a few days, he would go out just about every day, and he'd spend several hours, and it wasn't just idle time, it wasn't just alone time. He was out there and he was really studying the cattle, and he knew, and he would kind of miss them. He would often pair them up. Well, obviously when they're young, the mothers, they would go to their mother. But Dad knew them and knew generations, and Lawrence also, because Lawrence, and let me back up one step, Lawrence worked as a manager of the Robertsdale Livestock Office for many years, and that's a whole story in and of itself. I remember working there some, worked in the back some, worked in the ring. You never knew what was coming around. We all worked together as a team when we were there at the stockyard to protect each other, because some of them the animals were already upset, maybe angry, but some of them been pushed around, and some of them would really hurt you, and that was true on the farm too. But we had the cattle on the farm, and then hogs, and through the years, and we all had hogs, talking about from Dad's years. But then when we farmed together, we built up, and I'll kind of pass it to Oswald, because at one time I think we had around 100 to 120 brood sows, and he can kind of tell that chapter, cattle and hogs, and we had some horses, and now Claude has and his wife Carol have the registered quarter horses. But the hog operation was pretty important at that day.
We raised quite a few hogs, but I've kind of centered on that project. But hogs through the years have faded out in Baldwin County. There's not any big hog operations at all anymore. The population in the county grew, and the paper mill people would talk about it, smelled, and people who worked there said, well, it smelled like money. And so hogs had their own odor, and neighbors would begin to comment, and of course they smell like money to us too. But over the years, it's the growth of the county has kind of changed the dynamics of farming. It's more turned to row crops and to sod business. You see sod farmers as you go up and down the road all over. But the county has grown tremendously. When we grew up, it was rural. It was the farm to market roads. We kind of are mainly rivers on our north, Weeks Bay is on our west, and Mobile Bay is on our southwest, and Bonneville River's below us. So we were kind of in a little bit of a secluded area, but it's beginning to grow now. But it had not grown for a long time as much as central Baldwin County had. We can remember back when 59 was a 2-lane road through Foley, and then when you left Foley, it was nothing till you got down to Gulf Shores and crossed the canal, and that was only summer inhabitants. But after Frederick came through in 1979 and destroyed so much of what was there, as it built back, it began to build back with condominiums and other businesses, and people began to come there and buy property and build houses, and so it's grown tremendously compared to what it was before. When we were growing up, going down to the beach, you went down and it was beach. You go down now and you have to hunt a public beach, and the state park is a real lesson where it's got a big wide open space there that people can go to and spend time at. But the county has changed in the time that we've been here tremendously. We've seen it grow.
You was talking about going down 59, being a 2-lane. Years ago, I would go down 59 on a 2-lane road in a combine, and you might pass maybe 10 cars at the most from Foley to Gulf Shores. Now it's probably 5,000 cars you'd pass going down there.
Well, one of the things going down there, again, long before cell phones and communication, somebody would need to know that you're going down to the farm, because if you broke down, you'd just be down there or have to walk back, and it's a pretty long trip back. But it was interesting nowadays, and we're not out there on the roads that much with farm equipment. And I can say, and unfortunately, some farmers that are out there, those with the big equipment, it's so large now, it almost takes a whole highway. Some aren't as considerate or courteous as they should be. But the other part of it is when you're there, and if you're sitting in the cab or on the tractor, the equipment's so large, the combines are so large that you can hardly make it down the road between the mailboxes and the culverts and the bridges. I mean, like for the farmers. So there's pressure building. We know the numbers, and I won't say for sure, and this is not an exact statistic at all, but I would say comfortably that the population in Baldwin County in our lifetime's pretty much doubled and maybe doubling again. And so we do know it's changing rapidly. We were known as timber, and Claude mentioned seafood, that's important here, and farming through the years, turpentine and the other products that go along with it. And that's still important today in its own way in Baldwin County, certainly in Alabama, but in Baldwin County. But it's changed a lot, and we know the future pretty much is the beach and tourism. And I personally like to go down occasionally, but would rather go to the mountains. And so we in South Alabama maybe go to the mountains as often as we can, and people all across really the southeast, but the United States come here, and there's so much here to do as far as the sports complex. A lot of the national teams and competition is right here, Orange Beach, and right here in Foley Sports Complex. All of it's just grown. It's grown. Many of the changes are good, but some of us, and sometimes have been here, look back. Our former probate judge, Tim Russell, had through the years kind of taken an informal survey, and oftentimes in a public meeting he'd ask how many people were born in Baldwin County, and in recent years maybe 10% of a gathering, and that's not being critical, it's just showing that the communities have changed quite a bit. I would say when we grew up here, dirt roads, we knew most of the vehicles that were actually on the highway. If somebody traded, we'd know that. We'd kind of keep over that as kids. Now there is a story that way back when, during the Depression, we're about 10 miles from Foley, 5 miles from Magnolia Springs. We're kind of tucked in here in this area, as was mentioned. But in those days, sometimes they would only buy, and this is a story told, they'd only buy one tag for the whole community. And whoever was going to Foley that day would do what? They'd put the tag on the vehicle, go to town, come back, and then whoever else needed, I'm not sure if that quite met the law, and I'm not sure that it happened quite the way it was said. But during those years, in Depression years, I looked over some of the records of our mom and dad, and got a picture here, and this is, again, our dad, Ira Lipscomb, and his wife, Grace. She was known as Bobby herself, or many friends, but her maiden name was Lawrence, and lived in Fairhope. Her parents were in construction primarily, and I'd say the depths of the Depression, they actually moved to California, and that's part of the story, and we'd like to tell a little of that. I also mentioned 1953 going to visit. I don't remember that story, but if you can imagine 8 people, we were children, most of us, but 8 children in the station wagon today, it would be quite a trip before interstates, obviously.
It was a trip.
It was a trip. Well, we can get back to that in a minute, and y'all can tell some of your real memories of that. But just to know, and to know as far as the changes along the way, and to know Baldwin County, and it's our heritage.
The dad raised cattle, and he was used to cattle being on the range. Back in the 20s and 30s when he was a young man, everybody's cattle just grazed together through the woods. And if you had a house and you didn't want the cows in your yard, you built a fence around your house. And if you wanted them out of your garden, you made sure the garden was within the house fence or had a fence around it. And the cows just grazed wherever they wanted to through the woods. And they would settle down at night in the road. In other words, the road was a good open place for them to. And so if somebody was traveling at night, they'd come up on a herd of cattle and they'd have to blow the horn to get them to get out of the way, or even get out of the vehicle to get them to move. But then if you ran into a cow, you owed the farmer. You had to pay the farmer for the cow you ran into. And in the 40s, Alabama passed a law called the stock law that required farmers to fence their cattle in. And of course, Daddy, being used to them being out in the open, he opposed that at first, but of course he accepted it when it passed it at the state level. But he penned his cattle up at that point, and over the years there was a swamp south of our place that cattle were in, and he would have to trap them out of there until he got them all trapped out. And the very last cow that he trapped, he kept in our pasture in our yard for just sentimental reasons until she passed away. But it was what we called a wild cow, because it was the last wild one in the woods. But nowadays, if a farmer has a cow get out, he's responsible to the automobile owner if an accident happens. But that has reversed itself through the years. And
Oswald, I remember that cow well. We got pictures of her somewhere, but she had horns. But she was so mean, Daddy eventually cut the horns off. But I remember it was my job to feed her when we first brought her up. Daddy first brought her up there, and he had to jump off a horse and catch her to throw it, because it wasn't. She would never be pinned. She would, and the Bicor swamp was all along there, and so she'd start for that swamp, and you try to turn her with a horse, and there wasn't any way to turn her. She just gonna determine. And so Daddy jumped off his horse and threw her down, and his friends came up and they tied her up until they could get her in a truck and bring her home. But anyway, that cow, the reason we call her a wild cow is that you didn't go in the pen with her. I was a young boy, but it's my job to feed her and put water in there. And for the couple of months, I threw the feed in and I poured the water in a bucket through the cracks. But eventually, little by little, I'd open the gate and set that stuff in there, and she'd get more used to me until finally, I think it was 6 months before we opened the gate and let her go out into the big lot. And she stayed in there part-time and part in the small corral for probably a couple of years before we ever actually let her go out in the pasture with the other cattle.
But she turned out to be pretty tame before it was over.
Well, she got older, and she was around us all the time at the home place.
There's one other.
Speaking of my dad, well, back up and say that one thing that we inherited was we got to see a good example from parents, grandparents, and on back to be honest and fair in all our dealings. And an example of that is our dad. He lost his mother when he was 4 years old, so, and my granddad was always busy building boats, putting in crops, harvesting crops, whatever Pawpaw, we called him, Edward Preston, was doing. My dad had a lot of time on his hands, and he took it upon himself to check the cattle that I was talking about before the stock law. They might range 5 or 10 miles away from home, usually closer than that, but if they needed to forage further away, they would go. But he, like I mentioned earlier, almost every family, the Weeks family, several of them had cattle, and they mixed. And so once a year they would bring them in, they'd go gather them all up, bring them in to a corral and try to pair up the calves to their mothers. And my dad was the only one, since he rode through them almost daily during the week, he knew when a calf was born whose cow, which cow was their mother, and who owned that cow. So when they pinned them at branding time, they would make sure that Ira Lipscomb was in the group that pinned them, and they would, as they caught them, they'd say, "Okay, Ira, whose calf is this?" And say, "Well, it's Stanley Weeks, or it's Arthur Weeks, or whoever owned that calf, they would brand it, and no questions asked. They totally accepted whatever he said, and he could have cheated and kept a couple of them for himself, but they knew he would never do that. And that's the kind of example we had to follow. And I've told people a lot of times, if I don't do the right thing, it's not my parents' fault, it's my fault, because they taught us right.
And that carried over because at the stockyard, he was a weight master. And in those days, it started out with just the mechanical scales. And obviously, you know, and not just the jokes, but the stories of having your thumb on the scale. Daddy was always careful. Now, it did change. In the later years, they had electronic scales, and the cattle that would come in the ring were on the scales. And a cow could jump or move or whatever, and the weight could go up or down. That's beyond control. But our dad was specific and very careful, and he was, and I think that was known. And he was a weight master for many years there at the stockyard, again, along the way, and that was an important business, important part of his life. We've got a picture here, and as a young man, he enjoyed seeing the oxen go out and logging in the area. And in later years, our dad didn't play sports. He didn't give a lot of time to golf or any of those other things. But cattle was, and I won't say his life, but a prime interest. And in later years, he was able, and we've got a picture here, we can show that Oswald can tell the story, and he actually kept these steers. I think they died a natural death on your farm, didn't they? So tell that part of the story. This was Daddy's enjoyment.
He, as a young man, they had timbered with oxen, and they would hook up several teams of oxen together, but in his older age, near 60, he was nostalgic and wanted to break a couple of oxen to a yoke again, and I was living close there on the property with him, and I helped him train these oxen. We had to build a feed trough where each one would come up and eat, and you had to train them to eat on the right side as the way you hooked them up to the yoke. And so if they went up to the wrong side, you had to take a stick and make them get out of the way and get to the other side, and train them to eat side by side at the trough like you were going to yoke them up. And we gradually worked them until we got them where they would take a yoke and put it on their neck and yoke them up, and he'd pull logs with it. We didn't actually timber with it, but he did, in his older age, get a chance to go back and spend some time doing things that he had enjoyed as a young man.